The millionaire thought he was securing status by marrying a plain stranger. Unaware, the blood of Big Shaq ran through her veins. What began as a deal for legacy turned into a reckoning. No fortune could escape. This wasn't just a marriage. It was a storm hidden behind a quiet face. When the truth finally rose, the millionaire's empire cracked before the world could even blink. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. From the outside, Damien Vance seemed untouchable. A self-made millionaire with a portfolio of tech empires. His name evoked images of towering glass offices and city skylines bending to his will. His smile was rehearsed, his handshake perfected, his reputation spotless. But behind closed doors, Damien was a man obsessed with legacy, status, and a desperate need to prove himself to the world that once overlooked him. His fortune had bought him everything but one thing he craved most: unshakable social stature among America's oldest, most elite families. Money opened doors, but bloodlines, he learned, opened hearts. It was this gnawing realization that led Damien to a deal he never imagined he'd consider: an arranged marriage. He had laughed when the idea first surfaced at an exclusive country club brunch, over cigars and dark coffee. A whisper, a suggestion from another member whose last name dated back to a founding father. Old money circles don't always welcome newcomers, the man had said with a smirk. But marry into the right family, and you're golden. At first it sounded ridiculous. Damien believed himself above such medieval arrangement. Yet as he watched invitations to galas, partnerships and closed-door meetings bypass him in favor of real American dynasties, his pride began to splinter. The offer came subtly but swiftly. A powerful, discreet matchmaker, someone whose services were sought by the political and financial elite, reached out to Damien under the veil of utmost confidentiality. She spoke in careful tones about a family of distinguished lineage, one whose social capital far exceeded their current financial state. They had a daughter, not traditionally beautiful, she hinted delicately, but with a pedigree that could cement Damien's ambitions permanently. No scandal, no baggage, just pure opportunity wrapped in silk gloves. Damien's curiosity turned into hunger. He met with the matchmaker under the high arches of a private museum, walking among relics of past civilizations, men and women who once ruled empires, and whose faces were now cracked into dust. She handed him a file, nothing more than a photograph, a resume and a bloodline chart tracing back generations. Damien barely looked at the photo. It was the lineage that dazzled him, weaving through governors, senators, and captains of industry. His fingers trembled slightly as he tucked the file into his briefcase. A contract would follow. Nothing public, nothing binding yet. A gentleman's agreement, sealed by tradition and reinforced by expectation. And so Damien found himself at the brink of a decision that made even his steel stomach churn. Marry a woman he didn't know, didn't find attractive, and whose only asset in his eyes was the invisible currency of heritage. Still, his mind calculated risks faster than his heart could protest. Charm could be manufactured. Affection could be faked. Public perception was what mattered. Behind every powerful man was a woman who either polished or tarnished his name, and Damien was determined to shine. The first time he saw her in person was during a tightly controlled luncheon arranged by both families. The setting was a sprawling vineyard estate in Northern California, sun-drenched and dripping with old-world charm. Damien arrived in his custom-tailored suit, confidence radiating off him like heat waves. He masked his quick, appraising glance behind a casual smile when she approached. She was plain. No other word fit better. Her dress was tasteful but uninspired, her hair neatly pinned but lacking any spark. She spoke softly, her voice barely carrying above the clink of glasses and polite conversation. Damien caught himself tuning out before the introductions were even over. What he didn't notice, blinded as he was by his own shallow expectations, was the careful calculation in her eyes, the subtle strength in the set of her shoulders. He missed the unspoken communication between her and an older, towering figure standing in the background, a man whose easy smile and quiet power went unacknowledged by the polished crowd. Damien had no idea who he was. If he had looked closer, he would have recognized the man that millions adored, Big Shaq, Shaquille O'Neal, standing watch with the patience of a seasoned general. The luncheon ended with handshakes, fake smiles, and an unspoken agreement. Damien would proceed. He convinced himself he was the one doing the favor, that the family, though socially powerful, was desperate enough to accept a man of new money like him. He held his head high, his mind already moving to branding opportunities. magazine spreads, strategic partnerships that would flood his inbox once the union was announced. He didn't see the sadness in the girl's eyes as she bid him goodbye, nor did he notice Shaq's gaze, cool and assessing, following his every move. The contract arrived a week later, thin and elegant, tucked inside an envelope embossed with a family crest older than the country itself. Damien signed without hesitation, his signature a flourish of arrogance. Terms were clear: a year of public appearances, a merging of names at events, a carefully orchestrated narrative of romance and partnership. Private life was secondary. There were escape clauses, of course for extreme cases, but Damien barely read them. He believed he was walking into a future he controlled. Preparations unfolded with mechanical precision. There were dress fittings, photo sessions staged to look candid, dinners where Damien practiced smiling on cue. The girl, whom he still saw as nothing more than a stepping stone, followed suit quietly, agreeing to every arrangement without protest. Her name was Haven, an old name, strong yet soft, a relic of Puritan ancestors. Damien barely used it, referring to her as the bride or the asset, in his private thought. What Damien failed to recognize, what he refused to believe, was that power rarely moved in straight lines. It coiled, waited, and struck when arrogance left its opponent vulnerable. Heaven was no pawn, and her father was no silent observer. Big Shaq had spent a lifetime weathering storms Damien couldn't even imagine, and he had no intention of handing his daughter over to a man who measured worth by magazine covers and bank accounts. Shaq had agreed to the arrangement for reasons Damien couldn't begin to comprehend, reasons rooted in legacy, in pain, in the unyielding weight of battling prejudice while building an empire. The wedding was scheduled for early spring, when the hills turned green, and the air smelled of fresh beginnings. Damien rehearsed his smile, his vows, his carefully curated affection. He looked at Haven like a man inspecting merchandise, never questioning why she smiled back with a patience far too deep for a woman supposedly desperate for his approval. He didn't wonder why Shaq lingered in every meeting, silent but undeniable, or why the matchmaker's eyes seemed to flicker with warnings she never spoke aloud. As the date drew near, the temperature of the story shifted subtly. Little details began to slip: an overheard conversation about Shaq's protective instincts, a reporter's question that hinted at something deeper beneath Haven's unassuming appearance. Damien brushed them aside, too intoxicated by his own narrative to see the cracks forming beneath him. In his mind, he had already won. But fate, pride, and bloodlines never danced to one man's tune alone. Beneath the golden veneer of a perfect deal, storms gathered, silent and waiting. Damien had no idea he wasn't marrying a pawn. He was marrying a legacy he couldn't control, a heart he couldn't buy, and a family whose strength ran far deeper than any headline could capture. And soon Damien Vance would learn that the cost of underestimating real power was a debt no amount of money could pay. Shaquille O'Neal had always been good at hiding. It wasn't something she learned from books or polished in finishing schools. It was born of necessity, the art of blending into rooms that judged first and listened never. As the daughter of one of the most recognizable figures in the world, she had spent her life stepping sideways out of the spotlight, where Shaquille O'Neal commanded attention effortlessly. Haven moved like a ghost through spaces too small to understand her heart. She learned early that expectations could suffocate faster than any enemy could strike, and beauty in the public's ruthless eyes was as much a currency as it was a curse. Growing up, reporters had begged for glimpses of her life. Paparazzi hid in bushes. Drones hovered over her schoolyard. Strangers judged her in grocery store lines, hungry for scandal, desperate to unearth flaws in the child of a legend. Her mother, Shawnee, fought fiercely to protect her, but it was Shaq's steady hand that taught Haven the real lesson. Disappear when they expect you to dazzle. Stay silent when they demand a soundbite. Build your strength in the dark, not under the camera's glare. By the time she was 16, Haven could walk through her father's sold-out games without a single flashbulb finding her face. She became invisible by choice, not by accident. To the world outside, she was an afterthought, an ordinary girl, with no remarkable spark, no modeling contracts, no viral social media moments, no lucrative brand endorsements. In a culture that worshipped image above all else, she became what they could not categorize: unremarkable. Yet those who bothered to look deeper, those rare few who slipped past the armor she wore like a second skin, knew the truth. Heaven possessed a mind that could tear apart corporate empires and rebuild them stronger before breakfast. Her heart was a fortress of compassion, fortified by years of watching her father battle both personal demons and public prejudice. She was, in every way that mattered, a masterpiece carefully hidden in plain sight. When Damian Vance first laid eyes on her at the Vineyard estate, he saw none of it. To him she was a box to be checked, a necessary step toward a bigger prize. Heaven recognized the calculation behind his handshake immediately, the way his eyes flickered past her before fixing on her father. It didn't wound her, it amused her in a bitter, knowing way. Damian was not the first man to underestimate her, and he wouldn't be the last. What he didn't realize was that she had been prepared for men like him since the day she first understood the weight of her father's name. The decision to agree to the arranged marriage hadn't been hers alone, but it wasn't forced either. Shaq had laid the facts before her with the honesty that defined him. Alliances mattered. History remembered marriages more than courtships, and sometimes the most powerful moves were made from seemingly powerless positions. Heaven could say no at any point. That was the only non-negotiable clause. But when she saw the file on Damian Vance, the shape of the opportunity it represented, a deeper instinct stirred inside her. She wasn't marrying for love. She wasn't marrying for fairy tale. She was marrying to change a narrative that had too long been written by men like Damian, without challenge. In the weeks following the luncheon, Haven disappeared even further into the background, carefully cultivating the image Damian already believed. She wore muted colors, avoided flashy accessories, kept her conversation modest and brief. She let the narrative grow around her, each assumption layering like armor. In public she remained soft-spoken, deferential, easily overlooked. In private, she built her plans with the quiet precision of a master strategist. She knew that in a world obsessed with appearances, the most dangerous person was the one no one saw coming. Shaq watched all of it unfold, with a mix of pride and sadness. He had raised a daughter strong enough to play the game better than anyone, but it broke something in him to see her forced into battles she should never have had to fight. He trusted her judgment, knew she moved with purpose, but the ache of a father knowing his child would be tested by the worst humanity had to offer, gnawed at him. Still, he stayed silent, a guardian behind the curtain, ready to tear it down if Haven so much as blinked for help. What Damian failed to grasp was that lineage was more than just names on a chart. Haven's blood carried generations of resilience, of battles fought not on corporate boards but in courtrooms, locker rooms, classrooms, anywhere the color of skin dictated worth before talent ever had a chance to speak. Shaq's journey had been paved with shattered stereotypes and broken ceilings. Haven carried that same legacy, not in slam dunks or endorsement deals, but in the quiet, relentless refusal to be defined by shallow eyes. As the wedding approached, whispers floated through the elite circles. Who was this girl really? Some questioned the match, muttering about her lack of public profile, her absence from the charity galas, and Ivy League alumni rosters. Others, more astute, noticed the barely veiled deference some of the city's most powerful figures offered her in private moments. A senator paused too long to greet her. A tech mogul's wife curtsied slightly without realizing it. Small cracks appeared in the image Damian had crafted for himself, hints that Shaquille O'Neal was not the blank slate he imagined. But arrogance, especially the breed cultivated by unchecked wealth, has a way of deafening its host to inconvenient truth. Behind every carefully staged photograph, every orchestrated interview, Haven held her secret close. She was not marrying to elevate Damian's world. She was marrying to reshape it. Whether he realized it or not, by binding himself to her, Damian Vance was stepping into a game he didn't even know was being played. He saw a plain woman, a forgettable name, a stepping stone. What he missed was the storm gathering behind those steady, unremarkable eyes, the lineage of battles fought and won stitched into every heartbeat. He couldn't see that the world would not remember the deal he struck, but the reckoning it would unleash. On the final fitting day, when Haven stood before a mirror draped in silk and lace, she didn't see the insecure girl the world thought she was. She saw her mother's strength in the curve of her shoulders, her father's determination in the set of her jaw. She saw a future not given to her, but taken on her own terms. Damian would get the marriage he bargained for, but not the wife he expected. That much, she promised herself with a quiet smile, slipping the veil over her face as the cameras flashed outside the bridal suite. And outside, hidden behind tinted glass, Shaq sat waiting, watching the chaos he knew was about to ignite, not with fists or rage, but with truth so undeniable, so deeply buried, that even the richest man in the room, would have no choice but to see what he had tried so hard to ignore. Shaquille O'Neal had learned a long time ago that real power didn't come from towering over a crowd. It came from standing silent in the corners where others forgot to look. It was a lesson he had absorbed during the toughest seasons of his life, when cheers turned to whispers, and admiration curdled into envy. Now years later, it was that same quiet strength he wrapped around himself as he watched the man who had dared to put a price on his daughter's future. Shaquille O'Neal had learned a long time ago that real power didn't come from towering over a crowd. It came from standing silent in the corners where others forgot to look. It was a lesson he had absorbed during the toughest seasons of his life, when cheers turned to whispers, and admiration curdled into envy. Now years later, it was that same quiet strength he wrapped around himself as he watched the man who had dared to put a price on his daughter's future. Shaq didn't need to be told what Damian Vance thought of Haven. He saw it in the tightness of the man's smile, the distracted flicker of his eyes whenever Haven spoke, the shallow way he shook her hand at the engagement announcements. Damian saw a transaction where there should have been reverence. Shaq saw a battlefield where Damian thought he had already claimed victory. From behind the scenes, Shaq watched it all unfold with the patience of a man who understood that some lessons had to be earned, not given. At the galas, he melted into the sea of well-dressed attendees, blending into the background despite his massive frame. Most of the elite assumed he was merely another celebrity guest too famous to be questioned, too important to be approached casually. Shaq used their assumptions as camouflage, his gaze never straying far from Haven, never losing sight of Damian. He tracked the subtle humiliations, the way Damian introduced her with barely concealed indifference, the way he sometimes left her standing awkwardly alone while he chased after bigger names. Every slight was a note added to an invisible ledger Shaq kept inside him, weighing the balance between giving Damian the chance to change and preparing for the moment he'd need to intervene. Privately, the doubts gnawed at him. Had he made a mistake trusting this process, trusting that Haven could forge something good out of a foundation already cracked? Shaq had never underestimated his daughter's strength, but a lifetime of fighting battles against racism, arrogance, and ignorance had left scars too deep to ignore. He knew better than anyone that sometimes love wasn't enough to shield you from the world's sharper edges. Still, he had agreed to this marriage because he believed, deep down, in the possibility of redemption, even for men like Damian. At a charity event hosted by a prominent senator, Shaq took his position near the back of the ballroom, a drink in his hand untouched. He watched as Damian, wrapped in tailored arrogance, worked the room with practiced ease. Haven stood dutifully by his side, her expression a mask of perfect neutrality. There were moments, small, almost imperceptible, when Shaq saw the flicker of pain cross his daughter's face, quickly buried beneath a polite smile. It twisted something inside him, an old familiar rage he had spent a lifetime learning to master. But he stayed rooted, stayed silent, trusting Haven's plan even as every instinct screamed to tear it all down. Later that evening, when the speeches dragged on and the wine loosened tongues, Shaq caught a glimpse of Damian laughing, a little too hard at a tasteless joke told by an old money relic. It was a joke dipped in racism so slick most would pretend not to notice. But Shaq knew. He saw the way Damian chuckled without hesitation, without even glancing at Haven to check if she had heard it too. It was a momentary slip, but to Shaq it revealed more than hours of staged smiles ever could. He shifted his stance in the shadows, the drink still untouched in his hand, his mind a roaring storm of memories. He thought of the battles fought in courtrooms for the right to exist equally. He thought of the quiet indignity swallowed over decades, the glances, the whispers, the invisible ceilings. He thought of Haven, the child he had cradled with arms, the world said were only made for destruction, and how he had vowed she would never have to fight the same battles he did. And yet here they stood, history's cruel patterns repeating beneath chandeliers and champagne. In that moment, Shaq almost broke his own rule, almost crossed the floor to take Damian by the collar, and make him understand what price came with mocking things you didn't even bother to comprehend. But Heaven's glance, so subtle most would have missed it, stopped him. She caught his eye from across the room, her chin lifting slightly, a silent plea for patience. "Trust me," it said. "Let me finish what I started." And so Shaq stayed in the shadows, the giant unseen by those who thought themselves kings and queens. He stayed because he believed in his daughter's strength more than he believed in his own anger. He stayed because sometimes, the greatest act of love was to trust someone else's fight, even when your own fists ached for action. The weeks rolled on, and Shaq's surveillance continued. He noticed patterns Damien likely believed were invisible. The way he corrected Heaven's introductions to emphasize his own name. The way he subtly shifted conversations away from anything that might reveal Haven's intelligence or independence. Damien didn't see the depth beneath Haven's quiet exterior. He didn't realize that the still waters he so arrogantly dismissed were deeper and more dangerous than any storm he could imagine. At a private fundraising brunch, attended by the city's most powerful philanthropist, Shaq watched again. Damien spoke grandly about future ventures, hinting at new foundations, partnerships, charitable work. He sprinkled references to the upcoming marriage, like confetti, using Haven's name as a stamp of legitimacy, without once acknowledging the real woman behind it. And each time he did, Shaq's hands tightened slightly around his glass, knuckles whitening, breath slowing to keep the fury at bay. It wasn't hatred Shaq felt toward Damien. It was disappointment, the bitter, exhausting kind that only a man who had spent his life hoping for better could feel. Shaq had hoped, somewhere inside, that Damien would surprise them all, that he would rise to meet the woman he had so blindly agreed to marry. Instead, he sank lower with each passing day, too blind to see the gold he had been gifted, too arrogant to realize he was dancing on a battlefield he didn't even know existed. But Shaq wasn't ready to give up hope completely. There were moments, rare and fleeting, when he caught glimpses of something human inside Damien, a falter in his voice when speaking about the future, a genuine smile that slipped free when he thought no one watched. Shaq clung to those moments, knowing that redemption, like destruction, often began in the smallest cracks. Still, the day of the wedding loomed closer, and with it the mounting certainty that Haven's plan would not end in peaceful compromise. Something deeper stirred beneath the surface now, a tension coiled too tight to hold much longer. Shaq felt it in every breath, every glance, every false smile stretched across polished lips. The moment of reckoning was coming, and when it did, no amount of money or social standing would shield Damien from the truth he had refused to see. As the sun set behind the city skyline, and the elite gathered once more in a glass-walled tower to toast futures already decided in backrooms, Shaq stood in the shadows, unseen, unmoving. He was a mountain disguised as a man, a storm waiting for its moment to break. His daughter's destiny would not be stolen by ignorance. If Damien Vance had thought he was marrying an invisible woman into an invisible life, he was about to learn that some legacies were written not in ink, but in fire. And Shaq, watching from the darkness, was ready to let the flames rise. The morning of the wedding broke clear and bright, a cruel irony considering the storms gathering beneath the surface. The world outside the sprawling southern estate buzzed with activity, an army of planners, photographers and stylists weaving together a tapestry meant to dazzle society's cruelest eyes. Helicopters circled lazily above, capturing aerial footage of the spectacle, while luxury sedans lined the private drive, ferrying in guests whose names were stitched into the very fabric of America's elite. To anyone looking in, it was the perfect union, new money marrying old lineage, a merger disguised as love. But inside the mansion's heavy stone walls, the truth soured the air, thickening it until every breath felt like a battle. Haven sat in a high-backed chair, motionless as a team of stylists fussed around her. Layers of lace and silk clung to her like a second skin, delicate in appearance but weighted with the burden of what was about to unfold. She watched her reflection with detached calm, her dark eyes unreadable beneath the delicate veil that framed her face. Every pinned curl, every brushstroke of makeup, was another piece of armor she donned willingly, knowing the battlefield she was about to enter was one built not of guns or fists, but of glances, whispers, and carefully sharpened betrayals. Shaq stood near the French doors leading to the terrace, his towering frame casting a shadow across the pristine marble floor. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His presence alone was a steady drumbeat of strength, a silent promise that no matter how far this charade went, she was never alone. Haven caught his gaze in the mirror for a fleeting second, and something passed between them, something heavier than fear, stronger than doubt. It was an understanding born from battles neither of them should have had to fight, but did anyway, because the world demanded it. Downstairs, Damien adjusted his cufflinks in the gilded mirror of the groom's suite, a self-satisfied smirk playing at the corner of his mouth. To him, this day was a crowning achievement, a carefully orchestrated move that would cement his place among the very people who once looked down their noses at him. He wore a custom-tailored tuxedo worth more than most people's annual salaries, but all the silk and polish in the world couldn't hide the rot beneath. Damien didn't love Haven. He barely knew her. To him she was a vessel, a symbol of arrival, a ticket punched into immortality. The ceremony was held under a massive oak tree that had stood for centuries, its gnarled branches twisted against the blue sky like ancient hands reaching for salvation. Rows of white chairs fanned out beneath it, each seat occupied by someone who had come not to celebrate love, but to witness a transaction disguised as devotion. The air shimmered with heat and expectation as the string quartet played a delicate prelude, their music barely masking the undercurrent of murmured speculation rippling through the crowd. When Haven stepped out onto the lawn, escorted by Shaq, a collective hush fell over the gathering. Cameras clicked furiously, lenses hungrily capturing every step, every tremor of her veil in the soft breeze. She moved with a grace so effortless it seemed almost supernatural, her face serene, her hands steady. To the untrained eye, she was a vision of bridal perfection. But to those who looked closer, those who dared to see beyond the facade, there was a tension in the set of her jaw, a coiled strength in her every movement. Shaq released her arm at the altar with a reluctant grace, his fingers lingering a moment longer than necessary, imprinting a silent blessing on her skin. His eyes met Damien's briefly, no anger, no warning, just a hollowed-out emptiness that should have rattled the younger man to his core. But Damien, drunk on his own myth, saw only victory. He took Haven's hands with a possessive grip, squeezing just a bit too tightly, a silent reminder that she belonged to him now. The officiant droned through the familiar liturgy, weaving words of commitment and unity that rang hollow against the stone hearts gathered to bear witness. Vows were exchanged with mechanical precision, rings slipped onto trembling fingers, promises spoken with voices stripped of warmth. When the final blessing was given, and the command to kiss the bride echoed through the heat-soaked air, Damien pressed his lips to Haven's, with the triumph of a man sealing a business deal, not the tenderness of a man in love. The applause that followed was immediate and thunderous, not because the crowd believed in the union, but because they believed in what it represented. Power consolidating power, money marrying history. As the couple turned to face the sea of approving faces, Haven's heart beat not with fear, but with a steely resolve. The first battle had been won, not by Damien, not by the watching elite, but by her own silent refusal to break. The reception was held inside a massive tent draped with chandeliers and silk banners, a lavish display of wealth that bordered on obscene. Damien made his rounds, basking in the sycophantic adoration of men who had once dismissed him, women who now whispered promises behind manicured hands. Haven floated by his side like a ghost, her smile polite, her laughter carefully timed. She listened as Damien spoke of mergers and expansions, weaving her name into his ambitions, without ever pausing to wonder what dreams she carried in her own heart. Shaq remained at the edge of the festivities, a silent sentinel in a sea of false joy. He watched Damien with an unblinking stare, saw through the polished smiles and hollow toasts. He watched Haven too, saw the subtle way she navigated the minefield laid before her, never stumbling, never revealing the fortress that lay just beneath her skin. It pained him to see her endure it, but he understood better than anyone that sometimes survival was not about fighting back. It was about waiting for the right moment to strike. The first crack in the facade came during the father-daughter dance. The music shifted to a slow, aching melody, and Shaq took Haven's hand, leading her onto the polished dance floor. The guests fell into a reverent silence, all eyes fixed on the unlikely pair, one towering, the other delicate, moving in perfect, heart-wrenching synchronicity. Shaq bent low, whispering something into Haven's ear that only she could hear. Her smile faltered for just a moment, a flicker of something raw and unspeakably powerful crossing her face, before she masked it once more. When the dance ended, and Haven returned to Damien's side, the atmosphere in the tent shifted subtly. The air grew heavier, the smiles tighter, whispers stirred along the edges, questions unspoken but swelling in their intensity. Who was Haven O'Neal, really? What blood ran through her veins that could command a man like Shaquille O'Neal to look at her with such aching reverence? What secret had Damien blindly tethered himself to without understanding its weight? The night dragged on, each hour peeling away the layers of civility that held the fragile celebration together. Damien drank more heavily, his laughter growing louder, his gestures more careless. Haven remained composed, every movement measured, every glance deliberate. She knew the real storm hadn't come yet. She could feel it gathering on the horizon, a reckoning that would make the spectacle of today seem like the quiet before the earthquake. As the clock inched toward midnight, and the guests began to thin out, Haven stood on the edge of the dance floor, watching Damien charm another group of investors with promises dipped in honey and hubris. She felt Shaq's presence behind her, a silent wall of strength. She didn't turn to look, she didn't need to. They were bound by something deeper than words, an unspoken understanding that had been forged long before Damien Vance ever entered their world. The night ended, not with fireworks or fanfare, but with a quiet, uneasy truce. Damien believed he had won. The guests believed they had witnessed history. But Haven and Shaq knew better. The battle was far from over. It had only just begun. The invitation arrived in a thick envelope, embossed with gold. The kind of invitation that whispered of old money and new ambitions. It was for the annual Legacy Foundation Charity Gala, the crown jewel of the social calendar, where the city's richest and most ruthless gathered to congratulate themselves beneath the blinding light of crystal chandeliers. For Damien Vance, it was the perfect opportunity to showcase his new acquisition, his wife Haven. Or so he thought. Damien approached the event with the same arrogance that had carried him through every negotiation, every hostile takeover. He commissioned a bespoke suit stitched by hand in Italy, booked the penthouse suite at the hosting hotel, and arranged for photographers to be tipped off about his arrival. He hedged walking into the gala with Haven on his arm, their appearance sealing his ascent into the ranks he had once only observed from a distance. Damien believed appearances were everything. And he still believed Haven was nothing more than an accessory to complete the illusion. In the days leading up to the gala, he gave little thought to her preparation. She would dress modestly, he assumed, the way she always did, blending into the background, her plainness making him seem even more polished by comparison. He barely noticed when Haven asked for the day to herself, citing last-minute fittings and arrangements. He barely registered her absence from the endless meetings he attended. His mind was fixed on the triumph that awaited him, on the applause he imagined echoing in his ears when he crossed the marble floors of the Legacy Grand Ballroom. The night arrived cloaked in cool, expensive air. Limousines purred to a halt outside the venue, spilling out senators, CEOs, heirs and heiresses. Paparazzi thronged the entrance, flashbulbs bursting like fireworks, as the elite posed and preened. Damien arrived precisely at the hour he had planned, stepping out with a calculated smile. He reached back for Haven without looking, expecting to feel the familiar brush of her hand against his. What he felt instead was hesitation. A moment's pause that made him turn, impatient, ready to pull her into place like a piece on a chessboard. But when he looked, the words died in his throat. The crowd around him seemed to fall away, the noise dimming to a stunned silence. Heaven stood before him transformed, not by the heavy hand of stylists, but by the simple, devastating power of her own choosing. Her gown was a work of art, a river of deep sapphire silk that clung to her frame with effortless grace. Her hair, usually pinned and hidden, now cascaded down her back in soft waves, framing a face that had always been beautiful, but had until now refused to conform to society's shallow demands. The subtle glow of her skin, the quiet fire in her eyes, the serene curve of her lips, all of it struck Damien like a blow he hadn't seen coming. Around them the photographers recovered first, their lenses snapping hungrily as they captured what they knew instinctively was the real story of the night. Whispers rippled through the crowd, astonishment, envy, confusion. Who was she? Was that the same woman they had dismissed so easily? Damien stood frozen, his carefully constructed image cracking under the weight of the realization that he had never really seen his wife at all. Haven moved past him without waiting, her gown whispering across the polished stone. As she ascended the steps into the ballroom, she didn't look back to see if he followed. She didn't need to. She owned the room now, her presence radiating an undeniable command that turned heads and bent conversations toward her like flowers straining for sunlight. Inside the ballroom, under the vault of glittering lights, the transformation became even more impossible to ignore. Titans of industry and politics, men who had barely acknowledged her existence at the wedding, now vied for her attention with fumbled words and clumsy charm. Damien trailed behind, suddenly demoted from centerpiece to footnote, the cold realization sinking into his bones that he had underestimated, not just his wife, but the very foundation of his marriage. The night unfolded like a carefully choreographed symphony, each movement more brutal to Damien's ego than the last. Haven spoke with intelligence and warmth, her laughter a melody that drew in even the most jaded of hearts. She discussed art, philanthropy, technology, weaving her words with a fluency that left seasoned moguls blinking in admiration. She was everything Damien had always dreamed of standing beside, and everything he had failed to recognize when it mattered most. The humiliation cut deeper with every passing hour. Old allies patted Damien on the shoulder with forced smiles, their eyes already sliding past him to the woman he had so clearly undervalued. Potential investors he had been courting for months suddenly found reasons to excuse themselves from his orbit, only to reappear moments later at Haven's side, drinks in hand, laughter ready. Even Shaq, standing at the edge of the room like a living monument, couldn't hide the slight smile tugging at the corner of his mouth as he watched the reversal unfold. It wasn't schadenfreude that filled him, it was pride, sharp and fierce. His daughter had played the long game, enduring the slights and the shallow gazes, biding her time until she could reveal herself on her own terms. Shaq had taught her to fight with patience, and tonight she was winning without raising a single blade. Damien tried, futilely, to reclaim the narrative. He offered her his arm, made jokes at his own expense, even attempted grand declarations of admiration that rang hollow in the marble hall. Haven accepted his gestures with the same serene courtesy she had mastered months ago. Never rude, never dismissive, but never giving more than was required. The crowd noticed. The cameras noticed. The story wrote itself in the spaces between their strained smiles and Haven's effortless magnetism. By the time the award ceremony began, Damien was a man unraveling. He watched from the sidelines as Haven was called to the stage, honored not for her lineage or her marriage, but for her quiet work with underprivileged youth programs. A cause she had championed long before their engagement. Long before her name became useful to him. She accepted the crystal plaque with a grace that brought the room to its feet. A standing ovation that had nothing to do with her family name, and everything to do with the undeniable woman standing before them. Damien clapped too, because not clapping would have been a fatal admission. But inside, the applause rang like a death knell. He understood now, far too late, that he hadn't married an accessory. He had married a force of nature disguised as a ghost, and in doing so he had chained himself not to a quiet, obedient partner, but to a legacy he neither controlled nor deserved. As the night wound down and the guests drifted into the velvet night, Haven stood at the edge of the grand terrace, the city lights glittering below her like a mirror of stars. Damien approached uncertain, stripped of the confidence that had once defined him. He opened his mouth to speak, to apologize, to grasp at the fraying threads of a partnership he had broken before it ever began. But Haven turned to him with a look so calm, so devastatingly clear, that the words died before they found shape. She didn't need to say anything. Everything he needed to know was written in her eyes. The betrayal, the disappointment, the final merciful withdrawal of whatever hope might have once existed between them. The mask was gone now. The game was over. Damien Vance, the self-made millionaire who thought he could buy his way into history, had been outmaneuvered not by boardrooms or backdoor deals, but by the very woman he had failed to see. And as he watched her walk away, her silhouette swallowed by the rising dawn, he realized with a clarity that shattered him. He hadn't just lost the game. He had never even understood the rules. The days following the Legacy Gala were colder than any winter Haven had ever known. Despite the California sun still burning bright against the estate's manicured grounds, a silent, bitter tension settled into the corners of the newlyweds' sprawling home, threading through the halls like smoke. On the surface, everything appeared intact. The interviews continued, the photo shoots were scheduled, the curated smiles held just long enough for cameras to capture them. But behind the doors that no media lens could breach, the fractures widened, the walls thinned, and a war without weapons began to rage. Damien retreated first, hiding behind business trips and late-night strategy meetings, desperate to reclaim the narrative slipping from his fingers. His pride, already battered by the humiliations at the gala, nursed itself with bitterness. He blamed Haven silently, twisting the story in his own mind, until he believed she had somehow orchestrated his downfall, that she had embarrassed him intentionally. He couldn't comprehend that it was his own arrogance, his own blindness, that had set the pieces in motion long before the gala's glittering lights had ever been switched on. Haven, for her part, withdrew into a quieter kind of war. She moved through the house like a queen in exile, measured, polite, untouchable. She fulfilled her public obligations, without flaw, but offered Damien nothing behind closed doors. No warmth, no conversation, no access to the fortress she had built inside herself. Her silence became a mirror he couldn't bear to face, reflecting back every slight, every selfish miscalculation he had made. Still, Damien, too proud and too furious to admit fault, chose confrontation over confession. The first true rupture came one evening, when Damien, emboldened by scotch and self-pity, accused Haven of setting him up, of using him as a stepping stone for her own ambitions. His words, laced with resentment, hung heavy in the grand dining room, where crystal chandeliers cast fractured light onto the untouched plates between them. Haven didn't shout. She didn't flinch. She simply stood, pushing back her chair with a grace that made the gesture feel like a condemnation, and walked away without a single word. But the storm wasn't confined to the walls of their home. Rumors began to swell in the social circles they navigated. Whispers about Haven's true intentions, about how she had played the game better than anyone suspected. Darker whispers surfaced too, the ones rooted in an uglier, older prejudice that still clung stubbornly to the upper echelons of society. Murmurs questioning her bloodline, veiled comments about whether someone like her truly belonged among them, speculation about Shaq's influence in securing her position. Damien heard them all. At first he dismissed them, but resentment has a way of distorting even the sharpest minds. Over time he began to absorb the poison, let it seep into the cracks of his wounded ego, until it festered into something unrecognizable. He started to view Haven not just as a betrayer of his carefully built image, but as an invader into a world he still sought validation from. A validation he believed now slipped further from his grasp, because of her. At a private dinner hosted by one of Damien's oldest business allies, the prejudice boiled to the surface in a way that even Haven's composure couldn't shield against. A seemingly innocuous comment about preserving the integrity of old families sliced through the conversation, its meaning clear to anyone who had ever been on the receiving end of such coded hatred. The table chuckled politely, glasses clinking, forks scraping plates, as if the venom hadn't just been unleashed in plain view. Damien laughed too loudly, too eagerly, signaling his allegiance not to his wife but to the fragile approval of men who would never truly accept him either. Shaq, seated farther down the table, caught the moment in crystalline clarity. His hand tightened around the base of his wine glass, his eyes darkening not with rage, but with a sorrow so deep it seemed to steal the air around him. He had known prejudice his whole life. He had fought it in courts and stadiums, in boardrooms and interviews, in the unspoken judgments cast like shadows across every room he entered. But seeing it directed so openly at his daughter, seeing Damien, who was supposed to stand beside her, choose cowardice over courage, ignited something colder, something final, inside him. After the dinner, Heaven excused herself quietly, her movements precise, her head high. Shaq followed her outside to the veranda, where the cool night air pressed against the manicured hedges like an unseen crowd. They stood in silence for a long time, the city's distant lights flickering like restless spirits. Finally, Heaven spoke, her voice so low it barely stirred the night. "I don't need you to fight my battles," she said. "I just need you to let me finish them." Shaq's heart twisted at the steadiness of her voice, the unyielding strength she wore like armor. He wanted to scoop her back into the safety of his arms, to tell her she didn't have to bear this alone. But he saw it in her posture, the set of her jaw. She was already carrying the weight, and she intended to see it through on her own terms. He placed a hand gently on her shoulder, grounding her, a silent vow that no matter how far she walked into the fire, she would never be without a way back. Inside the house, Damien seethed. He watched the silent exchange from a window, bitterness tightening his chest. In his mind, the narrative twisted further. Heaven didn't need him. She never had. She belonged to another world, one he couldn't touch or control, a world that would never fully accept him. And so, he thought in the darkness of his pride, he would not accept it either. The war within their marriage was no longer about two people failing to understand each other. It was about something older, deeper, the collision of legacies built on very different foundations. Damien's foundation, built on image and ambition, hollowed by desperation. Heaven's, carved from resilience and sacrifice, tempered in fires he would never understand. Shaq knew the storm was reaching its breaking point. He saw it in the stiff exchanges between Damien and Haven, in the way Damien clung harder to public appearances, even as his private world disintegrated. He prepared himself quietly, gathering resources, allies, contingency plans, not because he didn't trust Haven to endure, but because he knew the depths of cruelty people would resort to when their illusions were threatened. He had lived it too many times before. At a private board meeting, meant to discuss a new philanthropic venture, one that Haven had championed for underprivileged youth, Damien's betrayal reached its peak. He subtly redirected the project's funds, rebranding the initiative under his name alone, erasing Haven's contributions from the official narrative. He smiled as he did it, sealing the theft behind handshakes and hollow praise, believing it would cement his image as the benevolent new force among the elites. The news reached Shaq within hours. He sat in his private office, the document spread across the mahogany desk, the theft laid bare in black and white. He read the words once, then again, each repetition feeding the fire building slowly, methodically in his chest. He didn't explode. He didn't raise his voice. He simply sat there, the weight of every injustice he had ever witnessed pressing down on him, until the decision crystallized clear and unshakable. Shaq would not stand by and watch his daughter's legacy be stolen by a man too small to understand its value. The time for silent observation was over. The war had breached the surface, and now, it would be answered. The question was no longer if the reckoning would come. It was when. The conference room gleamed with polished steel and unforgiving glass, a cathedral built for kings who thought wealth alone made them gods. Damian Vance stood at the head of the long table, flashing his practiced smile at the investors gathered before him. Behind him, a massive screen displayed numbers climbing higher, graphs arcing upward, the kind of story that made men sign contracts without bothering to read the fine print. Damian felt invincible again. The humiliation of the gala and the rising tensions at home blurred into a background he could easily ignore, especially now that the legacy initiative bore only his name. In his mind, this was redemption, a reclaiming of what he believed was always rightfully his. Then the doors at the back of the room swung open. The shift in the room was instant and electric. Conversations faltered. Pens froze mid-signature. Damian turned, a reflexive smile plastered on his face, expecting another investor, another pawn he could easily maneuver. But the figure that entered was no pawn, and the air itself seemed to bow in acknowledgement of it. Shaquille O'Neal stepped into the room not like a man, but like a force of nature, his presence vast, undeniable. He wore no armor of power suits or designer watches, just a simple black jacket, dark jeans, and the kind of gravitas that made even the most arrogant men remember, if only for a moment, what humility tasted like. His face was calm, but his eyes burned with a depth that made even the boldest in the room shift uncomfortably in their seat. Damian's throat tightened, a flicker of unease rippling through him. He tried to summon the smirk, the easy charm, but the words caught somewhere in his chest. Shaq didn't address him. He didn't need to. Instead, he stepped to the center of the room, facing the wall of projected numbers that told a story built on stolen credit and broken promises. "You forgot the real numbers," Shaq said, his voice deep and steady, carrying without needing to rise. Every head in the room turned. He pointed to the screen without looking at Damian. "You forgot the number of kids whose lives were supposed to be changed. You forgot the number of hours my daughter spent building this dream from scratch. You forgot the number of times you smiled in her face and stole from her with the same breath." Silence choked the room. Damian opened his mouth to defend himself, but Shaq lifted a hand, palm out, and the room fell still again. Not with the fear of violence, because Shaq had no need for fists here, but with the devastating weight of truth. "You forgot what legacy really means," Shaq continued, his voice dipping lower, heavier. "It's not about how many zeros you stack in your bank account. It's not about what magazines write about you. It's not about which circles you trick into clapping for you. Legacy is about what you leave standing after the applause fades. It's about who you lift up when no one is looking. It's about sacrifice and honor and fighting for people who can't fight for themselves." The words weren't shouted, but they struck with the precision of a master craftsman, carving through the thin armor of pretense that filled the room. Some of the investors shifted uncomfortably, glancing at one another, recognizing the deep fracture splitting the glossy surface of Damian's presentation. Shaq turned then, finally facing Damian. His expression wasn't angry. It was something far worse. It was disappointment, so profound it felt almost physical. "You stood next to my daughter," he said, voice low and deliberate. "You took her strength, her patience, her grace, and you treated them like currency you could spend." Damian tried to laugh, tried to spin the moment into something salvageable. "This isn't the place, Shaq," he said, forcing a chuckle that fell dead in the heavy air. "We're here to talk business." Shaq didn't move. He didn't need to raise his voice. The weight of his words did the work for him. Business built on lies isn't business. It's theft. Business built on prejudice isn't business. It's poison. And what you did wasn't just to her. It was to every kid who won't get the help they were promised. Because you cared more about your image than your integrity. The truth peeled back the layers in the room. There was no going back. Damien felt the shift like a physical blow. The subtle but irreversible turn of faces away from him. The silent judgments rendered by men and women who now understood they were complicit, if they stayed silent too. Shaq stepped closer, towering over Damien, but never touching him. His voice softened in a way that somehow made the words cut deeper. You judged her, he said. From the moment you saw her, you judged her by the surface. The way too many judged me, when I was just a kid, from Newark with big dreams, and a bigger body. You thought her worth was something you could measure in appearances, in quietness. You thought strength had to look like you, move like you. But strength doesn't need your approval. The words filled the room, sharp and clean. No anger, no hysteria. Only undeniable, heartbreaking truth. Damien's facade crumbled with every syllable, his face flushing with a helpless anger he couldn't direct. Not at Shaq, not at the truth, not even at himself. Because deep down, he knew it. He had known it from the beginning, but had been too blinded by his own ambition to care. Shaq turned to the investors then, sweeping them with a gaze that left no room for pretense. You all talk about legacies, about building a better world, about opportunity, about diversity. He let the words hang there, their hypocrisy bleeding into the marble floors. You sit in rooms like this and you nod your heads and sign your checks, but when it's time to actually stand for something, when it's time to lift the people who built the road you walk on, you get real quiet. The shame in the room was palpable, thick as fog. Some looked down at their hands. Others stared at the walls, the floors, anywhere but at Shaq, whose presence demanded they see what they preferred to ignore. I'm not here to threaten you, Shaq said finally, stepping back. I'm not here to burn it all down. I'm here to tell you that your time to choose is running out. Choose to do better, or get left behind. He let the silence that followed settle like dust over the room. Then he turned without ceremony and walked away, leaving Damien standing there, stripped of allies, stripped of narrative, stripped of the power he had built on sand and lies. The doors closed behind Shaq with a soft click, but the echo of his words lingered long after, reverberating through the glass towers and marble floors built by men who thought money could buy silence. Outside, the world moved on, unaware that inside that glittering tower, something had shifted forever. Damien Vance had built his empire thinking he understood power, thinking he could shape it, own it. But power had walked into that room today, wearing a simple jacket and an unstoppable legacy, and it had spoken not with rage, but with the kind of heartbreaking honesty that left no room for denial. And for the first time in his life, Damien understood that the battle he had thought he won was never his to claim. The aftermath of Shaq's confrontation left ripples that moved quietly through the circles Damien once believed were unshakable. Deals stalled, invitations dried up. Investors who once smiled eagerly across boardroom tables suddenly found pressing reasons to reschedule. Damien spent the following days scrambling, cloaking himself in anger to cover the fear creeping into his chest. In his mind, the problem was simple. Shaq had embarrassed him, had turned sentiment against him. But the truth was a more insidious poison, something rooted deeper, something Damien hadn't yet uncovered. It started with a letter. A thick envelope slid under the door of his home office late one night, with no name attached, only a simple, ominous line, handwritten across the front. For your eyes only. At first, Damien considered ignoring it. His pride, though battered, still resisted anything that hinted at weakness. But curiosity gnawed at him, and eventually he slit the envelope open, letting the pages fall into his lap like the beginnings of a funeral dirge. Inside were documents, emails, private messages, contracts, strings of correspondence that detailed conversations he hadn't known were happening behind his back. Words he couldn't pretend to misinterpret, typed out in clear, damning sentences, words from his own blood. The first page hit the hardest. A private email exchange between his father, an old money magnate obsessed with appearances, and a trusted advisor. The subject line was chilling in its simplicity, ensuring Damien's best interests. The body of the email was worse. We have serious concerns about this match. There is history to consider. Appearance, reputation. It may not be enough that her father has wealth and name recognition. There are things that cannot be hidden from the right eyes. We must act discreetly. Damien's stomach knotted. A slow, nauseating twist that threatened to pull him under. He flipped through page after page, each more toxic than the last. Plans to undermine the marriage, to isolate Haven, to siphon off her influence quietly, until she was little more than a trophy in Damien's cabinet of achievements. Not because she was unworthy, not because she lacked the pedigree they so craved, but because at the end of all their polished words and strategic positioning, the truth screamed from every page: she wasn't the right color for their version of history. There were memos to event organizers asking them to feature Damien alone in promotional materials, suggestions to limit her exposure in public appearances, and quiet bribes to certain media outlets to downplay Haven's involvement in projects associated with the Vance name. Damien's own mother had been involved too, her scrawled notes in the margins of printed social calendars suggesting ways to subtly steer attention elsewhere. The betrayal hollowed him out with surgical precision. These were not strangers, not rivals or enemies from the outside world. This was family, people he had spent his life trying to please, whose approval he had bartered pieces of his soul for, and they had moved against him, not to protect him, not to shield him from some imagined scandal, but because deep down, they believed that Haven, for all her brilliance and grace, would always be an outsider in their pristine world. For the first time, Damien saw the structure he had spent his life building, not as a fortress but as a prison. Every deal, every handshake, every forced smile had been a brick laid to win the favor of people who, even at the height of his success, never truly saw him as worthy on his own. And now he had delivered his heart, his future into their hands, only to realize too late that they would rather see him fail than accept the life he had chosen. Damien sat frozen for a long time. The papers spread around him like ash. His hands trembled, not with rage, but with the sick clarity that nothing he had believed about loyalty, about family, had ever been real. He wasn't angry at Haven anymore. He wasn't even angry at Shaq. The war he had waged against them, the resentment he had nurtured, had been a distraction from the real enemy, the one that bore his last name. A noise at the doorway pulled him from the spiral of his thoughts. Haven stood there, dressed simply, her hair pulled back, her expression unreadable. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. Damien knew she had seen the envelope, knew she understood what lay scattered across his desk. He opened his mouth to explain, to apologize, to say something, anything that might bridge the chasm now yawning between them, but no words came. Haven crossed the room slowly, her gaze sweeping the pages with clinical precision, her hands folded calmly in front of her. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft, but it cut sharper than any accusation. "You didn't just betray me," she said. "You betrayed yourself." Damien flinched as if struck. He wanted to argue, to fight back, but the truth was too heavy, too obvious. Haven moved closer, picking up one of the letters, an invitation to a charity gala where she had been intentionally erased from the guest list, and turned it over in her hands like something too filthy to touch. "I knew," she said quietly. "I knew they didn't want me. I knew they whispered behind closed doors. But I thought," her voice faltered for the first time, a crack that revealed the depth of the wound. "I thought you chose me anyway, that it didn't matter." Damien bowed his head, shame washing over him in waves, so strong he thought they might drown him. He hadn't chosen her, not fully, not when it mattered most. "I didn't know," he rasped, the words tasting bitter on his tongue. "I swear, Haven, I didn't know." She let the letter fall from her fingers, the soft whisper of paper against wood sounding like the final note of a funeral hymn. "But you didn't ask, did you?" she said. "You didn't look, you didn't care enough to see." The devastation in her eyes wasn't just about the documents. It was about every moment he had turned away, every time he had chosen ambition over empathy, appearance over truth, and now, faced with the ruins of what could have been, Damien realized he had been the architect of his own downfall. The conversation ended not with screaming, not with broken glass or slammed doors, but with a silence so deep it felt like a living thing, swallowing the last remnants of whatever hope had once existed between them. Haven turned and walked away, her footsteps steady, unhurried. Damien watched her go, feeling the full weight of his choices settle onto his shoulders with a final, crushing certainty. Later that night, alone in the vast emptiness of the house, Damien read the documents again, committing every word to memory. Not to build another empire, not to salvage his reputation, but because he knew that some betrayals couldn't be undone, only endure, and he needed to understand every cut, every wound, every scar, if he ever hoped to become a man worthy of forgiveness. But deep down, Even as he promised himself he would change, a darker truth gnawed at him. Some wounds, once made, never truly healed. The estate that had once seemed so grand, now echoed hollow and cold, every polished surface reflecting back the truth. Damien Vance could no longer escape. Days bled into nights without distinction, time stretching endlessly as he wandered from room to room, a ghost in the mansion he had built for a life that no longer existed. The world outside still turned, the stock market still rose and fell, but inside these walls, everything Damien had chased was crumbling, slipping through his fingers like dust he could not hold on to. He barely noticed the staff moving quietly around him, packing away the remnants of the grand life he had tried to orchestrate. Invitations to elite gatherings still arrived, but they were fewer now, and colder in tone. The phone calls he once answered with a confident grin now rang hollow and unanswered. The very people he had bent over backward to impress were withdrawing, their loyalty as shallow as the approval he had sacrificed everything to earn. But none of it hurt as much as the silence where Haven's presence used to be. Her absence was a wound he could not bandage, an ache that filled every corner of the house and every hollow space inside his chest. He saw her everywhere, in the books she left behind on the library shelves, in the kitchen where she once sipped coffee in the early morning quiet, in the garden where she once walked, her hands trailing lightly over the roses she had planted herself. Damien understood now that he had never seen her, not truly. He had seen what he wanted to see, what fit neatly into the image he had been so desperate to construct. And in doing so, he had lost something far rarer than the acceptance of people whose names filled glossy magazines. He had lost the loyalty of a woman who would have stood by him through any storm, if only he had valued her heart more than her reflection. He had lost the purity of a connection that didn't need branding or validation. He had lost a family whose very existence challenged everything he thought he knew about strength, legacy, and love. Shaq's words at the conference replayed in Damien's mind like a broken record, relentless and unmerciful. You judged her. You thought strength had to look like you, move like you. But strength doesn't need your approval. At the time, Damien had bristled, had fought against the truth, clinging to his anger like a shield. But now, stripped of his illusions, he saw the brutal reality of it. Haven had been stronger than he had ever deserved, and it wasn't her who had failed him. It was he who had failed her. He thought back to the day of the wedding, the way she had walked down the aisle with a grace he hadn't understood. He remembered the way she had smiled, so controlled, so composed, as if she knew even then that she was stepping into a battlefield disguised as a marriage. She had played her part with a dignity he had mistaken for weakness. And when he humiliated her, when he belittled her by choosing approval over love, she hadn't crumbled. She had simply risen higher, until she stood on ground he could never reach. The finality of it struck Damien hardest during an event he hadn't been invited to. A charity gala hosted by the O'Neal Foundation. A night dedicated to the programs Haven had championed for years without seeking recognition. The news outlets showed flashes of the event the next morning. Haven standing at the podium, her voice strong and unwavering, surrounded by the kind of community Damien had never truly understood. There was Shaq standing beside her, his pride unspoken, but undeniable. There were faces of every color, every background, gathering not because of prestige or networking opportunities, but because they believed in something bigger than themselves. And there was no space for Damien Vance among them. He had not just lost a wife. He had lost the chance to be part of something real, something enduring. He had traded authenticity for artifice, loyalty for status, love for ambition, and in the end he had been left with nothing but an empire of glass, shattering around him with every passing day. Sitting alone in his vast empty living room, Damien pulled out a letter he had found tucked inside one of Haven's drawers after she left. It wasn't addressed to him. It wasn't even meant for him to. It was a letter Haven had written to herself, a quiet affirmation penned in the fragile days before their wedding. You are enough. Even if they don't see you. You are worthy. Even if they never understand. You carry the strength of generations in your bones. You are not theirs to define. Damien read the letter over and over, each line carving deeper into him than the last. He had spent so much of their time together trying to mold her into something she already was. Extraordinary, but he had been too blinded by his own insecurity to recognize the gift he had been given. Now it was too late. He thought about reaching out, about begging for a second chance. But somewhere deep inside, he knew that any apology he offered now would not erase the betrayal. It would not undo the wounds he had inflicted, not just with his words, but with his silences, his absences, his cowardice. Haven didn't need an apology. She didn't need his validation. She had already built a life stronger and more beautiful than anything he could offer. The cost of seeing too late was living with the knowledge that some bridges, once burned, could never be rebuilt. As night fell over the empty estate, Damien walked out onto the balcony, the city lights blinking distantly on the horizon. Somewhere out there, Heaven was building something that mattered, surrounded by people who recognized her worth, not because of who her father was, not because of the way she looked, but because of the strength, the kindness, the brilliance she carried within her. Damien closed his eyes and let the silence wash over him. No crowds, no applause, no polished smiles, just the raw, aching truth that he had been given a rare and priceless love, and he had thrown it away, not with a single act of betrayal, but with 1,000 small failures of character. The world would move on. Deals would be made, fortunes would rise and fall, names would be celebrated and forgotten. But some losses carved themselves so deeply into the soul that no amount of time could erase them. Damien Vance would rise again perhaps, but he would rise alone, carrying the heavy, unrelenting burden of knowing that when the moment of true greatness stood before him, he had turned away. And no amount of power, no amount of redemption, could ever buy back what he had willingly, foolishly lost. The world didn't end when Damien Vance's carefully built empire cracked. The sun still rose, the tide still turned, and life beyond the glittering towers of ambition continued with a stubborn resilience he once would have ignored. In the weeks that followed his unraveling, he learned that real loss didn't look like bankruptcy or headlines. Real loss was quieter, more devastating. It was waking up each morning and feeling the absence of someone who had loved you when you didn't know how to love yourself. It was realizing you had held a diamond in your hand and thrown it into the ocean because you mistook it for a stone. Damien moved out of the mansion he once called a triumph and into a modest townhouse across the river, far from the estates and country clubs where he used to measure his worth. He needed the distance. He needed the silence. He spent long days walking the city streets anonymously, slipping through crowds unnoticed. A man shedding layers of false identity one step at a time. The truth followed him like a shadow. He had spent his life chasing approval from people who would never see him as enough, sacrificing those who had offered him unconditional love along the way. Meanwhile, Heaven flourished. Her work with the O'Neal Foundation expanded rapidly, fueled not by scandal, but by the authentic connections she nurtured wherever she went. New programs opened in neighborhoods that had long been ignored by the powerful, offering scholarships, mentorships, and hope. Articles no longer referred to her as Damien Vance's wife or Shaquille O'Neal's daughter. They spoke of her as a force in her own right, a leader quietly reshaping futures with dignity and grace. Shaq watched all of it from the sidelines, his pride a quiet fire that burned without consuming him. He didn't interfere, he didn't direct, he simply supported, the way he always had, understanding that the greatest victories were the ones built, not by force, but by faith. He had taught Haven well, not just to survive, but to rise without sacrificing the best parts of herself. Damien read about her in the papers, saw her face on television interviews, heard her voice in podcasts and speeches that overflowed with compassion and purpose. Each sighting twisted something inside him, a blend of pride, regret, and longing that he no longer had the right to act upon. He didn't reach out, not because he didn't want to, but because he understood now that redemption wasn't about asking for forgiveness. It was about becoming the kind of man who might one day deserve it. His own redemption began in the smallest, most humbling ways. He volunteered at shelters, not for photographs or press releases, but because he needed to understand what it meant to serve something bigger than his ego. He took business classes at the community college, sitting beside students half his age, who challenged his assumptions and forced him to listen more than he spoke. He attended diversity workshops, not to earn a certificate or a social media badge, but because he needed to confront the biases he had absorbed and perpetuated without ever questioning them. The process was brutal, stripping away the stories he had told himself about who he was and why he mattered. It forced him to admit that ambition without empathy was a hollow pursuit, that loyalty demanded more than lip service, that real love required the courage to stand against injustice, even when silence was easier. Months later, on a crisp autumn evening, Damien found himself standing outside the community center where Haven was scheduled to speak. He hadn't planned to come. He didn't even know what he hoped to accomplish by being there. He stayed on the outskirts, hidden among the crowd, watching her move with the same effortless strength that had once terrified and confused him. Haven spoke of hope, of resilience, of the power of community. She spoke of legacy, not the kind etched on skyscrapers or trophies, but the kind built through everyday acts of kindness and courage. She didn't mention Damien. She didn't need to. Her story had moved beyond him. But hearing her voice, seeing the lives she touched, filled Damien with a bittersweet gratitude he could barely contain. As the crowd dispersed and heaven greeted attendees with warm smiles and easy grace, Damien stayed in the shadows, content simply to witness her light without stealing a piece of it for himself. He turned to leave quietly, his heart heavy but peaceful, when a familiar voice called out behind him, "You just gonna sneak away?" Shaq stood there, arms crossed, his massive frame still exuding that impossible mix of calm and authority. Damien swallowed hard, unsure what to say, what he even had the right to say. But Shaq shook his head slowly, a small smile breaking through the gravity of the moment. "You changed," Shaq said simply, not a question, but an acknowledgement. Damien nodded, the lump in his throat too large for words. Shaq stepped closer, his voice lowering. "Change don't erase the past, but it does mean you don't have to stay stuck in it." He glanced back toward the center where Haven still laughed among friends and families, her joy untouched by the past. "You did her wrong. You know it. I know it. But she ain't built to hold grudges. She's built to build bridges." Damien blinked hard against the sting in his eyes. "I don't expect anything," he managed to say. Shaq clapped a heavy hand on his shoulder, the weight of it both grounding and forgiving. "Good," he said, "because this ain't about what you expect. It's about what you give, from here on out." They stood there for a moment longer. Two men tied together not by blood, but by the legacy of one woman's unwavering belief in the possibility of better. Then Shaq nodded once, a silent invitation Damien didn't dare misinterpret, and turned to walk back toward the center. Damien stayed a few moments longer, watching Haven in the golden glow of the building's lights. He didn't approach her. Not yet. He wasn't ready, and maybe she wasn't either. But he knew now that redemption wasn't a destination. It was a road you chose to walk every single day, even when it was hard, even when no one else was watching. And for the first time in a long time, Damien Vance was willing to walk that road without shortcuts, without applause, without promises of reward. From the ashes of his failures, something new was rising. Not a bigger empire, not a grander image, but a quieter, truer kind of life. A life rooted not in what he could take, but in what he could give. A life built not on the shaky foundation of pride and prejudice, but on the solid ground of humility, acceptance and love, that asked for nothing but gave everything. The stars blinked overhead as Damien walked away from the center. His footsteps steady, his heart lighter than it had been in years. The night stretched out before him, vast and uncertain and beautiful. A new dawn was rising, and this time, he intended to meet it with open eyes and an open heart. Some stories aren't just told, they're felt. If this journey stirred something real in you, you're exactly where you're meant to be. Stay close. We're just getting started. The next story might change more than your mind. It might change your heart.